Cool Air is a story written by H.P. Lovecraft in 1926 about a magazine reporter in New York who is unusually repulsed by drafts of cool air. If the short summary of the story I gave you doesn't sound like it's going to turn into a horror story, I mean, you're not alone in that feeling. That's kind of the point, actually. We talked about that a little bit in the What is Weird Fiction video, and we'll come back to this in a bit. The story goes that this gentleman moves into an apartment building, one floor below a sort of aged man who keeps some kind of motorized mechanism in his room. Well, one day the narrator finds a puddle of ammonia in his room that leaked from the ceiling from upstairs, and through some interactions with a frankly terribly racially stereotyped landlady, he finds out that the man above his room is a supremely skilled but aged doctor, and that the ammonia leaked from some sort of cooling system that the doctor uses to keep his room basically refrigerated. This information comes in useful when one day the narrator has a random heart attack in order to advance the plot, and stumbles up the stairs to the doctor's room. The doctor treats him exceptionally well, and from that point onward, he and the doctor become pretty good friends. The tale culminates in a horrible revelation when the refrigeration unit breaks down one day in the summer. Go read the story yourself, or listen to it in the required reading video that I posted about it before you go any further in this video, because otherwise it won't make any sense, and that's what I made the required reading video for, so go watch it. Are you all caught up? Okay, good. So, let's start talking about the meta story, the circumstances surrounding how this story was written. Lovecraft was well known to be basically scared of everything. He was also not very good with science or math, which is pretty evident in a lot of his stories. And furthermore, it is painfully evident that he was at least a little racist, a little classist, and mostly just a total asshole. We know that he was affected more intensely by cold than the average New Englander, and so that might be a piece of this story's background as well. So how about some context? Lovecraft spent 2 years living in New York, a profoundly unhappy portion of his life, because it separated him from the only part of the world of which he was not scared, that being his hometown of Providence, Rhode Island. He regarded this portion of his life as being just mundane and boring and depressing, and he felt that he was just kind of like going through the motions of whatever was going on in his life at the time. And during this time, he wrote a total of 5 stories, the last of which is Cool Air. It makes sense, therefore, that the unnamed narrator was also a transplant from somewhere else, doing some dreary and unprofitable magazine work as a sort of Mary Sue Exby of Lovecraft himself. And you'll find this sort of self-inserting of Lovecraft himself into his own stories a lot. More subtle at times than others, but this one is not exactly the most subtle. In this New York phase, as I'm going to call it, however, it's the most common type of protagonist lens that he's got. Lovecraft hated New York. All the stories he wrote during that time also paint New York in a less than tantalizing light, we'll say. Cool Air's New York is one that has too many people, too many foreigners, and too many low-class folk for Lovecraft's liking. The narrator himself, in this case, is a middle-class gentleman who's a little bit down on his luck, gee, I wonder where we've heard that, and drifts from boarding house to boarding house, looking for a cheap but livable place to be, because obviously he can't live somewhere that's low class. Lovecraft himself was actually pretty hard-pressed at this time as well, and had to resort to some pretty extreme measures to make it with very little money. The XP meter is pretty maxed out for this story. We can address his propensity to be a little bit racist in 2 ways. The first is that he was fundamentally averse to other people in general, and found that he was only able to really relate in any way to those of the white upper middle class into which he was born and bred. Yes, kind of racist, but therefore the poorer types, as well as those of a different skin color, were seen as unrelatable, and to old Howie that meant that he was scared of them. The second way is to do the not-so-great historical argument of, oh, everyone was racist at that time, so it's not surprising. Well, you're right, Many middle-class or higher white males with a platform were likely to be weirdly racist, but that doesn't excuse that it was happening in the first place. Just don't be racist assholes and you'll be fine. The racism in this story comes in the depiction of the landlady and her son, and the other tenants in the house. The landlady, it's so bad. I really feel bad having done the accent at all in the story. The landlady is described outright as a slatternly, almost bearded Spanish woman named Herrero, who has the strangest transcription of an accent I have ever tried to read as being Spanish, bordering on comically stereotyped and weirdly transliterated. The other tenants in the building are mostly quote-unquote Spaniards, a little above the coarsest and crudest grade. So what, we grade Spaniards now? Good way to really dig a hole there. Herrero is readily congenial and desperate to make sure her new tenant is happy with his room and board, and tries in her bad grammar and far too heavy accent to explain that her son takes care of some of the errands for the doctor, but the doctor's genius and virtuosity are such that he does most of his own work himself. The doctor himself is also a Spaniard, but he's instantly sold as being a higher class than anyone else. A man of birth, cultivation, and discrimination. Where Herrero really only gets a description that details how she's basically got a beard, Munoz, the doctor's physical description, takes up an entire paragraph extolling how handsome and well-bred he is. The story even states specifically that he's one of striking intelligence and superior blood and breeding. So, are we grading the Spaniards now? I guess we're grading the Spaniards now. But enough of the weirdly racist meta, let's actually talk about the themes and motifs of the story now. Munoz tells our dear narrator about a time when he was afflicted by a life-threatening combination of diseases and was taken under the wing of a Dr. Torres, who is from Valencia, Spain. Valencia is a pretty nice place, and the insinuation here is that Torres was also of a superior bloodline and breeding, but again, that's beside the point. Back to the themes. Torres implanted within Munoz the ideas that life could be extended indefinitely with the proper science, and saved his life with some, what is essentially medical cures for his maladies. However, magic has got a cost, and so in order to remain functional, Munoz has to be in a strictly regimented temperature range, or else he would experience catastrophic and deadly organ failure. So here's the first bit of foreshadowing in the story. This is the Chekhov's shotgun of the threat of something terrible happening as soon as the cooling system inevitably goes out. I have a lot of questions about this, but we'll get to those at the end. So, narrator Kun becomes a regular visitor to Munoz-senpai, who loudly proclaims himself as the bitterest of sworn enemies to death. He's still getting older and closer to actually dying, however, and he has to keep upgrading his cooling systems to be colder and colder in his rooms, as well as writing long documents to be posted on his death to people like a French doctor who everyone thought died a while back, but about whom rumors of terrible things apparently circulated. This also is another step of that foreshadow. Someone who should be dead doesn't need to receive letters because they're dead, right? So why bother sending those letters at all? Ooh, totally foreshadowing and not really obvious. Act 3 of the story begins when one day, after a long period of narrator Kun's visitations had gotten him pretty close to his dear Dr. Senpai, narrator Kun hears a frantic banging on his ceiling from above. And he goes to see what's wrong, only to find that Chekhov's shotgun has been finally fired. He finds out that the cooling system has started to fail, and the doctor implores him furiously to get as much ice as he possibly can, and also to help fix the system, or else bad things will happen. So narrator Kun obliges. He hires like a random transient outside to continually buy ice from anywhere he can find it and bring it up to the room for the doctor, while he himself goes out to try to find the parts that will fix these pumps. The guy he hires is labeled as a seedy looking loafer, and the setup is such that he's supposed to bring ice up to the door to the bathroom in which Munoz is holed up. Don't look inside! and then go get more ice and repeat the process, and then money will come from that. Inevitably, because of course this is how this thing is going to be, this is the way that it's set up, the transient looks into the room and then flees in terror, screaming wildly, while narrator Kun is out. When he actually does return with some workers and a part that I assume is supposed to be able to fix the pumps, the whole room, like part and parcel, is locked up tight, and there is a terrible stench that pervades the entire floor. They contemplate breaking down the door, since no response can actually be gotten from inside, and that's when Herrero displays one last bit of stereotype by producing a wire that can open the door even when it's locked. What's that supposed to say about her? Huh, Howard? What's that supposed to say? That she has plans to break into any apartment and look through their stuff? That she's gonna steal all of her stuff? Stop grading your Spaniards! Anyway, they get the door open to find the now predicted doctor's body turned into a melted pile of decay with a scrawled explanation of what had happened that basically amounts to, bet you figured out already, but I've been dead all along and just using science to kind of stay alive. How about that? And that, dear readers, is why the narrator doesn't like cold air. So leaving aside a lot of questions about how this story could have taken place in the first place, even following its own internal logic, the story does a clever thing with its premise. Remember how earlier I was like, this story probably doesn't sound like a horror story at all and you're not the only person to think about that? That is actually precisely the point. While this may not be the actual, like, poster child example of this thing, weird fiction takes the mundane, the stuff we think we know about, and turns it up on its head in a way that it becomes horrifying because it shouldn't or can't happen. Lovecraft takes a thoroughly mundane concept, that of cool temperatures being useful for preserving the longevity of perishable things, and extends it further than it should be extended. What if the body were the thing that must be kept cool? What if, as long as the body is mostly functional, life will not depart from it? What if science could keep a body from decaying indefinitely, such that a semblance of life could be extended ad infinitum so long as the technology stood? What if that thing is already happening this very minute in even so mundane a place as a random neighborhood in New York? Possibly right above your very heads. Not all of Lovecraft's stories have to do with those terrible, unnamed, horrible entities from beyond space, but that's the beauty of this supergenre. All it takes is a concept that is sort of mundane and easily accepted as being pretty normal, and a desire to surprise and creep out your audience, and you have the makings of a weird fiction story. You can see this like turn-the-table style of theming in many of his other stories, like The Cats of Ulthar. Take the mundane, change it up, boom, horror story. Contrast this with his other favorite template, things start going weird and then it's actually some kind of terrible monster, like The Color from Out of Space and At the Mountains of Madness. Those two tropes are what make up most of Lovecraft's body of work. This one specifically is the significantly more relatable version because it doesn't require monsters. It just requires the weird. And the foreshadowing in the story is a little bit predictable, of course, because anyone who is genre savvy will pick up exactly what's going on and exactly what's going to happen pretty early in the text by reading these context sub-clues. The lines like, "And I remember his tactfully consoling me about my weak heart by insisting that will and consciousness are stronger than organic life itself, so that if a bodily frame be but originally healthy and carefully preserved, it may, through a scientific enhancement of these qualities, retain a kind of nervous animation, despite the most serious impairments, defects, or even absences in the battery of specific organs." Plus, the fact that he lives in a refrigerator are basically exceptionally transparent indicators of the twist at the end of this story. if it can indeed be called a twist these days. However, this sort of transparent broadcasting of the intent of the story is actually useful in short fiction like this one, as it engages the reader's sense of pattern recognition and makes them feel sort of clever when they figure out what's going on without wasting too much of their time by trying to build it up further and further and further, like a novella or even a full-length novel would. Where novels are like the candle that burns really slowly, short fiction has to flash brightly like a camera right off the bat, and quick, lest it lose the attention of the reader. If nothing else, Lovecraft's story structure, as is apparent in much of his work, is well suited for this sort of short type of piece. Setup, weird stuff, horrible realization, punchline. We don't need an outro or exit to the story, really. We'd much rather be left on the hanging long note of this sudden conclusion that just leaves us slightly behind satisfied and slightly in front of horrified. But okay, serious question. If Munoz needed to be refrigerated after his dark science revivification lest he deteriorate, and that thing happened 18 years ago, how has he kept himself in the same room with a cooling system for the past almost 2 decades? Especially when that sort of business hasn't been implemented for, like, consumer stuff yet. It's mostly been for packaging and for factory stuff. Shouldn't he have melted while in transit from one place to another? And if he hasn't lived in this house for that long, then how much time did it take for him to install the system in the house before he would melt? And furthermore, why did he move to New York if he needs to be somewhere cold all the time? Why didn't he move to somewhere like the northern portions of Canada, or somewhere like Greenland, or somewhere that just has cold all the time? Why did he move to New York, where the summers can get so swelteringly hot? Come on, Howard! Please, think through some of your plot holes. Anyway, so that's a little bit of a discussion about a piece of weird fiction by Lovecraft. Keep your eyes out for the next set of stories that we're going to do. Probably the next video that I'm going to put up on the channel is not going to be a literature thing. It's going to be about a serial killer. But we'll get to that because it's all weird junk to begin with. And I like me the weird junk. So thank you guys very much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, the like and subscribe buttons are waiting just below this video. You can push them. Please do that thing, because if you don't, then my refrigeration unit will break down and I will turn into a vat of goopy, gross decay, and then you'll never get videos from me again. Thank you guys again so much for watching. Look out for the more stuff that's coming out in the future. Keep reading. And if you have suggestions for stories that you want me to talk about, put them in the comments. I will see you next time.